So my 10-year-old son likes to begin a story out of nowhere. He used to start his compositions with one day. And until I told him, you need to be more creative. Everything you write begins with one day. You need to be more creative. So now he starts with a dialogue. He tells me, I don't know how a story should begin. I can only write what happens. So reading his compositions, I know he has a bright future writing reports. But that is another story. But my son taught me a useful lesson though. How should stories begin? Whose stories are we telling? Who are we in the story? Where are we telling the story from? Wait, the arrow right or left? Oh, shit. I only know how to tell stories, yeah. Okay, so let's consider this photograph. One day it was raining, a woman sheltered an old lady with a hijab, and someone photographed her thoughtful gesture. The end. Just the way my son would write his compo. But this picture went viral, and the story that anchors it tells us a lot about what multiracialism means in Singapore. The emphasis on the Malay hijab girl being oh so kind to cover the head of a random Chinese old lady with her tudung. Except the old lady was her grandmother. Except they didn't have an umbrella. Except she was the child of a Chinese man who married a Muslim woman and became Muslim. Except, why is this even a story? Sakina would later write on her blog that she felt like an animal on exhibit, both exposed and violated. Because, as she quotes, people feel they have the right to decide whether or not she's my grandmother or some random Chinese lady, just based on their yet to mature worldview, end quote. Sakina's personal story drops the mic on racial harmony or any attempts to racialize harmony or any attempts to harmonize racism. Like Sakina, I too am an outlier, a trans-identified queer Malay Muslim with a PhD. As an outlier, depending on which axis of privilege we intersect, be it class, race, religion, gender, or sexuality, the stories we tell often goes two ways: reshape the mainstream or be forgotten altogether. What kinds of stories gets remembered in Singapore? Okay, this way it works.
Okay, so it's just like that.
Oh, okay. So growing up in Singapore, the only true Singapore stories that I used to believe in were by Russell Lee. Okay? So my first lesson in multiracialism was in understanding that there was a Chinese hell that was different from a Malay hell. Okay? That Chinese see Chinese ghosts and Malays see Malay ghosts. And Indians, they see everything. So it got me thinking, are ghosts in Singapore so adept at racial profiling? Oh, what is going on here? So obviously for this course today, for this talk today, I'm going to talk about Singapore stories. Thank you, Russell Lee, for that cover page. Okay, so in 2009, I was spurred to examine the history and representation of the pontianak in Singapore for my master's thesis. Because of the mass anxiety that was surrounding something called Nenek Keropok, an old Malay lady who goes door to door, specifically targeting Malay houses, begging people to buy her keropok, which is some kind of fish snack, okay? So if you should refuse, and never refuse an entrepreneurial spirit, okay? She would unleash the pontianak into your house. So in 2009, mind you, I was writing my thesis on the pontianak, so this should be a good opportunity for me, right? I made my house I was cohabitating with my then girlfriend as un-Malay as possible, because I didn't want the Nenek Keropok to come in. So this was not difficult, given that there was no Bismillah or Arabic scripture on my front door. And I also had a painting of two naked women staring at each other's naked bodies with the caption, "Chaos in the Cosmos." So I thought that was enough as a protection. So I was so confident that the nenek keropok would skip my un-Malay house until one day, I was home alone writing my thesis and someone knocked on the door and said, keropok, nak beli keropok. So my first instinct was to move far away from the door as possible. And second, the inevitable question, how she know I'm Malaysia? So my reaction was best explained by Michael Bell, that our sense of rightful possession of place depends in part upon our sense of the ghosts that possess it, and the connections of different people to these ghosts. Ghosts make claims about the territories of social life. Ghosts are political. Thus, the possession of place by a ghost is not an immaterial phenomenon. So this is why I took the Pontianak very seriously, because it represents something that makes people feel haunted by a presence in contemporary Singapore. So my belief is this, the Pontianak is political. So I spent, and this picture over here, the Pontianak Awareness Program, that was found, I think, in Singapore General, no, Changi Hospital. Yeah, the old Changi Hospital. So I spent a year between 2008 and 2009 listening to Malay people calling into the local radio segment called Misteri Jam 12, otherwise known as Midnight Mystery. It's still going on, so you can tune in to 89.7, I think, to listen to that radio talk show. But you got to understand Malay. So I also went on ghost hunts, spoke to Malays who claimed they could see ghosts or have experienced being haunted or possessed. I analyzed over 60 narratives. I found that Pontianak hauntings reveal everyday social tensions of living in a multiracial and highly competitive society. They mirror our everyday realities and ironies of social policies. What does it mean for the Pontianak to be alive in Singapore? So according to the narratives I gathered, the Pontianak roams along the corridors, car parks, void decks, and staircases of public housing flats. The standardized nature of public housing makes it pertinent for her to make her mark on places. The very notion of citing, I saw a Pontianak there, differentiates that space from others. The Pontianak is also selective of the houses she chooses to haunt. She possesses the stock of knowledge to enter houses Malays own and to avoid those that are not. She is aware of racial quotas with regards to resale flats previously demarcated as Malay enclaves. The ghost of a Malay flat is passed on to the next Malay owner, while the Pontianak already existing in flats of Chinese or Indian occupants lay dormant, symbolizing the lingering residue of previous Malay occupants and an anticipative desire for potential ones to make her presence known. I was told a few times that hantu Melayu tak kacau orang Cina. Malay ghosts do not disturb Chinese people, and vice versa. Whatever the Chinese are afraid of, it does not affect the Malays. Thank God, right? Since there's 75% of you. Lai Ah Eng, in studying meanings of multi-ethnicity in the public housing of Singapore, demonstrates this effect by highlighting how the highly standardized design of public housing provokes residents to personalize their homes. So given these persuasive circumstances of multi-ethnic living in Singapore, most residents would find it necessary to establish territories of self through identity markers. So due to this intrusiveness of state policies, private spaces becomes the most controllable part of residents' living environment. So for the Malays who are at the margins of Singapore's foray into this brave new world, the Pontianak sightings represents forms of strategic control over their environment, as well as, I would argue, a creative strategy to reframe the limitations of the environment. So another example that I found in my studies is that not all kampongs are nostalgized equally. We often hear the state leaders say, bring back the kampong spirit. You know, you see that in Joseph's schooling, right? Everybody rallies to basically throw in a champion. But what does this nostalgia for the kampong mean? And most importantly, whose kampong are we referring to? So the Pontianak is the embodiment of the rurality. It's an expressive energy of the Malay kampong collective, and whose continued presence in urban Singapore highlights the existence of a memory of place. So this durability, okay, is a concern to the state for whom the supposed existence of a tightly knit minority Malay community often bears negative connotation and consequences. In 1979, Abdullah Tarmugi issued a statement that the Malays brought with them most of their neighborly attitudes from the Kampong when moving to the HDB flats. Almost 30 years later, in June 2005, the Straits Times ran the headline, Kampong Spirit Alive in Estates, to highlight the findings of the HDB Sample Household Survey 2005. The findings showed that Singapore Chinese were the least neighborly and had a weaker sense of belonging and community involvement than other ethnic groups such as Malays and Indians. In a survey conducted the previous year by the Straits Times, Malays were also found to be the most neighborly compared to other ethnic groups. However, in July 2005, Minister Mentor, the late Lee Kuan Yew, professed how racial integration in neighborhoods has not been completely successful because the rate of intermingling and acceptance is faster among certain groups than in others. He singled out the Malay community as an example of such a failure. And he says, I quote, "They've centered around the mosque more than the other social centers we've got. Not quite what we'd hoped for." You see, I live in Seligi, and right above where I live is the RC, Resident Committee area. And every Thursday, they invite people to come and gather and just have a ball of time. And I wonder, what does it feel like to participate in such spaces? Why are there only Chinese people in such spaces? Well, it's not easy, it's not really hard to kind of deduce because every time and each time I visit that RC, you only hear Chinese karaoke songs being played. And I don't think any Malay or Indian person want to waste their precious time belting out to tunes that they are not really familiar with. So that's why mosque became a successful magnet to attract certain groups of Malays in Singapore. So Lee's statement reveals the discursive formation of the Kampong spirit, as a space of Malayness that was to be regarded as less than complete space or successful assimilation into a multicultural society. So let you bring the Kampong spirit. If it's Chineseness, that's what we welcome. But if anything else, any minority representation, it becomes suspicious. On September 2007, at Mendaki's 25th anniversary dinner, Lee Hsien Loong recalled that the government and the Malay community leaders were not sure whether the Malay community could really cope with meritocracy and compete with other Singaporeans. Okay, in Singapore, the stories that get remembered are the ones that are constantly repeated. Repetition begets its own reality. On that dinner, PM Lee's narrative of the Malays was no different than any other state narratives of the Malay community. It begins with the long, arduous task for the Malays to get here, because we are from there, right? The significant progress that they have made in education, increasing social mobility, and then boom, dysfunctional families, unmarried pregnancies, broken families, poverty, etc. But not to worry, Malays should keep working hard because the government is confident that Malays can make it the Singapore way. So in Singapore, stress has been justified as a necessity for the people to stay on the competitive edge in order for the nation to survive in a brave new world. Yet this acknowledgement of stress onto various groups in Singapore are not equally regarded. The government's politicization of stress makes it difficult for certain groups of Singaporeans to articulate how stressful they are without being labeled as incapable or undeserving of assistance or relief. For underprivileged minorities, stress is personalized as individual failure or lack of resilience, while stress for the privileged is validated as productive and a badge of diligence. It is worthwhile to note that the bulk of the narratives that describe encounters with the pontianak also professes sentiments such as, I was possessed because I might have been tired from work, or I had to stay school till late, or come back from work late. Interestingly, in some of the narratives, contributors also describe feeling feverish and ill after encountering the pontianak. Such symptoms of illness warrants a day off from school or work to cope with the trauma of their frightening encounters. This latent imagery of being exhausted from school or work, coupled with this haunting experience of the pontianak or being possessed, may describe the anxieties of being in a stressful environment, a common experience among Singaporeans. Moreover, from my research, the visibility of the pontianak in areas of high Malay numerical populated areas corresponding with middle to low income housing areas demonstrates cultural anxieties to survive in a competitive capitalist economy. In this manner, the pontianak may exist as a vehicle for the Malay individual to express his or her anxieties in a common space, but private and secret enough and intimate enough that it escapes the scrutiny of the state. Because any news of Malays publicly complaining of Singapore's highly stressed environment may almost certainly invite criticisms from the state or even local Malay agencies that the Malays possess some forms of cultural deficit. We are easily contented lot or lazy as compared to the other races. This culture of haunting reminds us that the distinction between conformity and resistance in relation to the dominant Singapore story of multiracialism is hardly clear-cut. On one hand, the stories that I hear reveals how pervasive the CMIO model is, and on the other, it reveals the ways in which people reappropriate the limiting structures that they are embedded in. It reminds us that most of the times, strategies to trouble mainstream narratives are not always for or against power. On the contrary, as activists, the important lesson here is that everyday stories capture nuances in which people find meaning in working in and on dominant ideologies. Maybe sometimes it is best that stories begin out of nowhere, because not all characters share the same beginning. Searching for a people's history thus requires a return to a contested beginning, not of how the same story is told, but rather the point of which another interpretation, memory, experience, history was about to be forgotten, and then we rescue it. This is our intervention as Singaporeans, to remember who we are in the stories that we tell, and where and how a story is told. Is it from a prison or from a palace? That is the key to harnessing power, to fuck with it so everyone can have a piece of it. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was great. Thanks, Ad. I'm actually quite annoyed now. I've never been tekan by Hantu Melayu. I mean, can I file a complaint with someone? This sort of discrimination.